So here we have a PDF data mapping configuration with the boundaries already set. So my first source record has one single page, and my second record has 2 pages. As far as data mapping is concerned, it makes zero difference whatever font, whatever spacing, and whatever icons and colors you use in a PDF. So it can be as dull as this one, or it can be as flashy as any invoice you receive in the mail. So let's start by extracting the record data, which is basically the data that is only once for each record. So the address, customer information, etc. There is a couple of ways by which you can extract multiple lines of data. The easiest one is to simply do a big data selection and then hit extract. And by default, this actually extracts one single field where each of the lines is separated with a line return. If we were to use this data selection inside of a template, it would actually display using the line return. So you would have as many lines in your template as you have lines in the data here. However, if we want to do anything with the individual lines, so check the address, check postal code, print the phone number in a different way, then we need to separate them. If you have one data selection with multiple lines, all you need to do is to go in the step properties, and for that field, you can actually change it to split the selection into many fields. What this does is create one field for each line, and the field name is determined in 2 different sections. So the name of the extracted field at the top, and the name of the individual fields at the bottom. Now there's another way to extract data, and it is to do it line by line. In that way, you have a full control over the field name instead of having a 2-part like we have here. Now here's a trick. When you do a data selection on a PDF, you can actually move that data selection whenever you want, and it doesn't actually affect the extraction. So if I do a selection on the first line here, I can move it afterward without affecting any of the extractions. Let me show you how this is useful. By extracting this first line, moving the selection, and extracting the second line. Now you may have realized that I used 2 different buttons between the first extraction of the whole address block and the extraction of the individual fields. In the first one, I clicked on Add Extract Step. What the Add Extract Step does is create a new step into which it adds the extracted data. Whereas in the 2 individual fields on the top right, I actually use the Add Extract field. Why do we have these 2 options? Well, here's the thing. The more steps you have in your process, the less optimized it is. And actually easier to look at inside of the steps, because the more steps you have, the more it's complex to look at, as well as unoptimized. Speaking of steps, one thing you can do is rename them. There's 2 ways you can do that. The easiest is to simply click on the step name inside of the steps pane, and then you can change that here. Or if you go in the step properties at the top, you can change it here also, such as correcting the small typo I just put. You can also add a comment to your step right here. Another thing that's important in regards to PDF, and this applies to text files as well, is that if you click on a selection in the data model pane, you can actually modify this data selection directly. So if you move the actual selection, it will change the extract step to reflect the change that you did. So here I went from customer to invoice information, and that's the same data selection I moved. Now, if you want to avoid moving existing extractions, There's an option at the top of the data viewer that lets you lock all the selections. By doing this, all your existing selections can't be modified, but you can, however, add new ones. So let's say I want the full address block to be one selection as I have here, but I also want to have the email separate. Then I can simply do an extraction of the email and it doesn't touch my existing selection. And through the magic of editing, we now have all of the information properly named and extracted, except for the transactional data. So let's do that now. So the first step is to tell the data mapper where to start extracting information. So here, what we do is to select where the extraction will start and use the go-to step. Now the go-to step is pretty versatile. In this instance, it jumps to a specific location, but as we'll see in a couple of seconds in the loop, it can actually jump a small amount any number of times or jump a variable amount of lines depending on how we set it up. So in this case, it just jumps to the first line. It'll always jump to that location. The next thing we want to do is to create our loop. In order to do that, we need to determine when the loop is going to stop. As far as this data source is concerned, it's pretty easy. When we see the word subtotal in the middle of the page, we know that all the line items are finished. So all I need to do is to select the subtotal and click on the loop. Now the loop is also versatile. It can loop until a statement is true, so until we see the word subtotal. It can loop while a specific statement is true, so while you see something on the line. It can loop for every element on the page, depending on the data file you have. So when we create the loop, it automatically creates a go-to step within it. And in this case, it jumps to the next line with content. So it can detect that there's many lines between the start and end of the loop, and it automatically just goes one after the other. And now that we have a proper loop, we can start extracting data within that loop. So here, if I click on the beginning of the loop, then I know it's going to be added between the beginning of the loop and the go-to. So all of the fields for the detail tables are extracted. What we're missing now, the only thing that we didn't extract, is the subtotal, tax, and total in the end. Thankfully, this information always appears at the end or right after the last line of transactional data. Because of the way the data mapper actually shifts its current selection to where it's extracting data, when we get to the end of the last line, all we need to do is to select these 3 lines, make sure we're actually at the end of the repeat, so after the repeat by selecting it, and then hitting extract. We'll also split these into 3 fields. So the fields are actually added to the record, not the detail lines, because they're only extracted once. They're not part of a loop. Besides, we only want them once. So now we know that the extraction process works for the first source record. Let's take a look at another. So what we can see on this second page is that all the detail lines are extracted properly and that the totals at the end are also extracted properly. However, we have a bunch of extra lines in between. So what we need to do is to filter them out. How do we do that? We're going to use a condition step. So the condition needs to be based on something that only appears on our detail lines. And because on the detail lines we have currency or prices, then the dot always appears at a specific location. So basically, all I need to do is to select the dot and add a condition to it, making sure that the beginning of my repeat step is selected. And that will create a condition where any line that is a detail line has a small green check mark, and any that is not, so that will be ignored, has a red X, so we know is not extracted. However, our extraction is not currently within the condition, so if we just drag it in, then we have the proper number of detail lines, and our extraction process is complete and functional for every single one of our records.